Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3. I'm filming in a different wall in my office, trying to get you the whole view. Some of you have already seen it, but this one could be really interesting because stuff's been falling off this wall all day because of the construction that's going on downstairs. But anyway, I want to give a brief overview of the discussion this week, some comments based on your papers and the rough drafts to your first section, and we'll go into kind of summarizing the readings for last week using quotes from your thought papers. We'll conclude as usual with a discussion of the readings for this week, which, it's Thursday already, so you've probably already dived into them already on your own. First things first, looking at your section 1, I thought you guys had some great ideas. Instead of using endnotes or footnotes, just give me links. And let's keep these things as, the hypertext links within the text. One way to help you kind of understand how to use hyperlinks as well is, and I don't think this is a hard and fast rule, but it's a rule that I've always followed. If you're quoting something that's an opinion, so you're saying, Maureen O'Dowd says eating pot cookies is great, then you would actually link to the verb. So maybe like is great or says. So that's clear that it's an opinion that you're linking to. If you want to give us more background information on Maureen O'Dowd, so if you're linking to a name, then that usually goes to like a Twitter page or a personal page or a Facebook account or something like that. That's usually information about that person. If you link to a noun like report, it tells us that we're looking at a printed official document that's not someone's opinion. It's okay if all the sections aren't all the same length. And always think about opportunities too, especially if you're struggling kind of for things to come up with. This is a wiki. You can put your calls to action or your requests for information that you're looking for right there and at the end to help you get the audience to fill in. You don't have to have everything about the topic there, but you do have to have enough to get the discussion started. The multimedia components that are required, you don't have to create these yourself. As long as you link to someone else's multimedia, like a YouTube video that you embed or a graphic that you found somewhere, as long as you give credit, I'm okay with that. But try to involve multimedia because it will involve people more in your content and hopefully more into the discussion. Moving on then, let's talk about this week's discussion. I thought some really interesting concepts were brought up. First off, hats off to the student who brought up Gesellschaft und Gemeinschaft. I always remembered Gemeinschaft, meaning community, because that's, mine. That feels closer to me. Gesellschaft basically means society in general. And you talked about some really interesting connections between them. For me, and I think I wrote this in someone's comment, I see community as separate from society. Society you can almost equate to ideology. Those are the things, the influences that we have that we don't even recognize. Where community are the things that where we put ourselves, where we kind of define ourselves and we find our place in. That moves me to my next point too. I thought you brought up some really specific and interesting examples of online communities and offline communities that you belong to. I wanted to see maybe some more examples of online communities where you feel that you are just as involved as at, say, your OU community. A few of you brought up and talked about lurkers. This is a concept that I've been researching a lot. The one thing I don't think we talked about, and that gets overlooked a lot when talking about lurkers, is what are the benefits of lurking? Too often we only equate lurking with a bad thing, that these people aren't involved, that they're the free riders. But lurking can be a really important first step to getting involved, because it's through lurking that you start learning the social rules and norms of the community so that you can fully participate. In summarizing the readings from last week, there's a couple of key concepts, and I've actually turned them into questions that I want to talk about. First off, there was a lot of discussion about what are online communities and how do we define them. There's some really interesting quotes that you guys had that dealt with this question. Isn't that the beauty of the internet? That you can be anywhere in the world and talk with a complete stranger about something you are both passionate about. It is to me. I think this student really echoed the idea that the internet brings people together of common interests, and it ignores geography. However, on the other hand, is the man who spends much of his time participating in a global communication experiment actually lonely, or is his apparent loneliness simply a failure on the onlooker's part to recognize a new form of community? That's a really almost transcendental question. I see this Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. But I think it's a fair question to ask. The second point that many of you brought up in your thought papers was, where do the rules come from? And what are the rules of online communities, if there are any? And our first comment examines how the internet was designed to be open. This was a quote that many of you gleaned from the Jarvis reading. It is interesting that Jarvis reminds us that the internet is a forum of open conversation, where everyone goes on the internet. Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and news articles are all open conversations for anyone to say whatever they like. There is a community throughout all of this, and I never even noticed. I like reading things like that because it gives me a sense that maybe I'm opening you up to, thinking about and considering new things. But another question about the rules of online communities has to do with the bonds that we form with people online. Unfriending someone on Facebook or leaving a mean comment on a photo can and most likely will transfer into physical relationships. The same principle applies to online interactions pertaining to current events or on news websites. The conversations and opinions happening on the web are not constricted to the web. They are influencing and molding society. That might also serve as a response to the first question about what are the impacts of communities and where are they formed. Maybe they're formed around interest, but they have real world impacts. One of the other common threads that I saw in your papers that I think we need to spend a little bit of time talking about is the difference between conversation and creation. Jenkins talks about this the most. When communities involve us, and we may want to talk about Star Wars or talk about Survivor, but when do we take the next step from just talking about it to creating something more? This, I think, has a lot of reference to my next point. Why does someone become a citizen journalist? Citizen journalism, I find, is a lot more about creation than it is just about conversation. If I go online and I leave a comment at the end of a news story, I don't consider myself a citizen journalist. But if all of a sudden I say, no, I want to get involved in this story, I've got this footage of what happened and I want to post that on the internet, that is a next step, and I think that's something that's greater. The conversations that we create can lead to that, but we can't assume that those conversations will turn everyone into a citizen journalist. Citizen journalism is something that is rare, I think, and is motivated by a lot of different things. And in fact, you have to also think that most people who become citizen journalists really only do it for one issue or one idea or one story. Somebody who has a blog that regularly covers news in their area, I wouldn't call them a citizen journalist. I'd call them a journalist. Jarvis especially talks about the power of the internet to correct itself. And he and a lot of other people aren't so worried about misinformation or, utter falsehoods being uttered on the internet because the internet is so quick to correct those. That's a hard position for a lot of people to accept. Nobody wants to knowingly put out there or support falsehoods. But I think we have to give the internet a little bit of credit and go back to the idea of communities and what their purpose is to understand that maybe some of these errors will get corrected on their own. And in probably a more efficient process than we have ever done in the old media. Finally, and there were a lot of quotes that you guys had about this last question, how do journalists and in turn other industries adapt to online presentations? The first quote deals with something that Jarvis said that I saw repeated in a lot of papers. It says, Jarvis states that the true subject matter of journalism is the conversation the public is having with itself. So when the internet was created, journalists were corrected. That might be one reason why it's been hard for journalists to adapt, because they felt a little chastised by the conversations that they're seeing on the internet. The next quote goes like this: I feel that many journalists have forgotten part of the news is to get the public involved and not simply to lecture to them. However, as citizen journalism grows, that ideology will be relinquished because there will be no other option. So in other words, how do journalists adapt? Well, they better figure it out because they're going to have to. This next quote also recalls Jarvis's statement, but looks at it in a little bit different way. This public conversation has an unprecedented amount of power to shape the way our society works, meaning journalists need to not only learn how to adapt to it, but to facilitate it. And this student actually offered one reason why journalists have had a hard time facilitating this discussion. But where the media, including journalism, goes wrong again is by creating this double standard of encouraging conversation and participation, yet discouraging creation and use of the media they are conversing about. One of the key ways to bring those two things together is what this student suggested. The core of the new community is equality, and journalists should discard the authoritative stance, trust in the collective intelligence, and encourage openness in conversations online. And as always, I like to end with a word of optimism. All of us could learn lessons from the digital era. It's not as chaotic as we might think. We might just need more time as early modern readers to adjust to the decreased auditory stimulation of the printed book. Maybe the best is yet to come. The readings this week all kind of focus on legal issues to some degree of online journalism. If you're ever thinking about legal issues on the internet, this is the person to really go to. Lawrence Lessig is one of the founders of the Electronic Freedom Foundation. He's also one of the key men behind the Creative Commons license. He really thinks they do more to discourage creativity and protect corporate interests than they do to protect the artists or the people that are involved. Chapters that we're reading out of this book, Remix, deal with how to make a hybrid, how to ensure that artists are able to share freely, but also profit from what they're doing. In this book, The Master Switch, Tim Wu writes about a lot of examples of when the internet and corporate powers try to come together and what ultimately happens. And then finally, Rebecca McKinnon writes about the perspective and the point of view of the users and how they have fought against corporate powers and efforts to overtake the internet. All right, well, that's all I have for this week. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for participating in the class. I hope you're enjoying the class. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll talk to you next week.